The new series has arrived, and the new series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with My Hero Academia. So without wasting time, let's start the series. Sakura pressed her back against what remained of a weapon stall near the Akimichi compound, her medical nin pouch digging into her spine as she stared upward. The fissure in reality stretched from the Hokage monument to the distant forests beyond the village walls, and through that wound in the world came ships. Not the crude vessels of invaders she had read about in mission briefings. These were geometric impossibilities, sharp-angled things that seemed to move between dimensions rather than through them. They descended without sound, without wind, without any of the natural laws that Sakura had spent her entire life believing were absolute. "Sakura!" Shikamaru's voice cut through her paralysis. He materialized from the smoke beside her, his shadow already stretching across the rubble. "You need to move. Now!" "What is this?" she heard herself ask, and hated how small her voice sounded. She was a kunoichi of Konoha. She had fought in the Fourth Great Ninja War. She had punched Kaguya through a mountain range. She should not have been trembling. Shikamaru's face was pale beneath the soot. His strategic mind, the thing that had saved them all more times than anyone cared to count, seemed to be running at a speed that caused him physical pain. "I don't know. That's the problem. I've never seen anything like this. The sensors couldn't detect them until they were all ready." The world exploded. Sakura didn't hear the blast so much as feel it, a compression of everything she was, followed by a release that sent her tumbling through debris that had been building seconds before. She hit the ground hard enough to crater it, her chakra-enhanced body absorbing impact that would have reduced a normal human to paste. Pain screamed through her left arm, and she knew without looking that the radius had fractured despite her reinforcement. She pushed herself up anyway. The Hokage monument was gone. Not damaged. Not crumbling. Gone, replaced by a crater that steamed in the alien darkness. The faces of the leaders who had defined her nation's history, Hashirama, Tobirama, Hiruzen, Minato, Tsunade, Kakashi, had been erased as if they had never existed. In their place stood a figure. He was massive. That was Sakura's first rational observation. The being who now stood where the mountain had been was easily 10 meters tall, his skin the color of old stone, and just as unmoving. He wore armor that seemed less constructed than grown, ridged and organic, and crowned with spikes that caught the dying light of Konoha's flames. But it was his face that froze the blood in Sakura's veins, that chiseled, cruel geometry of a jaw, those eyes that burned like dying suns. He was not looking at her. He was looking at everything, and finding it beneath him. "Shikamaru!" Sakura breathed, not knowing if he could hear her. "Who is that?" Her friend's voice came from somewhere to her left, shaky in a way she had never heard before. "He called himself Darkside. Before he—" A pause. "Before he killed the sensory team." Sakura's stomach lurched. "The sensory team? All of them?" "All of them." She wanted to ask how. She wanted to know what kind of power could erase trained shinobi, men and women who had survived wars and assassinations and the worst the world had to offer, before they could even raise an alarm. But the question died in her throat as the first wave of things began pouring from the cracks in the sky. They were not human. They were not animals. They were soldiers, she realized, but soldiers made of nightmare logic. Too many limbs, too few features, bodies that seemed to be in constant pain that they expressed only through movement. They descended on Konoha like a tide, and the screaming began. Might Guy had opened the seventh gate twice in his life. The first time, he had shattered a Jinchuriki's ribcage. The second time, he had held off 6 S-rank missing nin long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Both times, he had felt the cost in every cell of his body, the burning, tearing, screaming protest of flesh pushed beyond its natural limits. Both times, he had told himself that the seventh gate was the edge of what a mortal man could achieve. He had lied. Because now, watching the thing they called a parademon rip through a squad of chunin like they were made of paper, Guy understood that there were no edges anymore. There was only survival and death was winning by a margin that made his soul ache. "Guy-sensei!" Lee's voice cut through the chaos. His student fought beside him, his weighted bandages gone, his body already steaming with the heat of the 6th gate. "There are too many! We need to fall back to the—" An explosion swallowed the rest of his words. Guy moved without thinking. His body, conditioned over decades of impossible training, pushed past every limit that conventional wisdom had ever conceived, launched him through the air faster than sound. He caught Lee around the waist and kept moving, rolling across the cracked earth of Training Ground 3 as the spot where his student had been standing became a crater filled with orange-black fire.
What was that?
Lee gasped. Guy looked up at the ships hanging in the ruined sky. He looked at the figure on the mountain, the one who hadn't moved since he'd appeared, the one who watched the destruction with the detached interest of a man observing ants. And he remembered something that Jiraiya had told him once, years ago, in a moment of drunken honesty about the dangers that existed beyond the shinobi world.
There are things out there, Guy. Things that make Kagaya look like a schoolyard bully. Things that have been conquering worlds since before our ancestors figured out how to throw a punch. If they ever find us.
The old toad sage had shaken his head and refilled his cup.
If they ever find us, run. Not because you're a coward. Because running gives you a few more seconds to pray.
Guy had laughed at the time. He wasn't laughing now.
Lee,
he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands.
Find Kakashi. Find anyone who's still breathing. Tell them that I'm going to buy them time.
Lee's eyes went wide.
Guy-sensei, no. You can't, the 8th gate.
I know.
Your life. I know, Lee.
Guy smiled, and it felt like the hardest thing he had ever done.
But I looked at that thing on the mountain, and I realized something.
He stood, rolling his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of his nunchaku in his hands.
I've spent my whole life trying to prove that hard work beats talent. That a nobody can become somebody through sheer determination.
He cracked his neck.
Today, I'm going to prove that a nobody can become somebody and take a god down with him.
Lee was crying. Guy pretended not to notice.
Go,
he said softly. And then he opened the gate. The 8th gate of death, Shimon, was not like the others. Where the first 7 gates were doors that could be opened with sufficient training and willpower, the final gate was a wall that could only be breached by someone who had already accepted their own ending. The chakra that flooded through Guy's body was not energy from his tenketsu points. It was his life, burning itself as fuel, converting every moment he had left into pure destructive power. The air around him turned red. His hair, already distinctive, became a corona of flame. His skin darkened, then cracked, then began to glow from within, the light of a soul refusing to go quietly into that good night. And somewhere in the distance, he heard Kakashi scream his name. Guy didn't look back. He launched himself at the figure on the mountain. Darkseid noticed the insect 2 seconds before impact. It was impressive in its way. The creature, male, middle-aged by the standards of this primitive world, possessed of a physical conditioning that was remarkable given the planet's technological limitations, had somehow accelerated to velocities that approached light speed. The air around him had ignited into plasma. His very presence was beginning to scorch the ground below him. If Darkseid had been capable of amusement, he might have smiled. He wasn't. He raised one hand, casually, the way a man might brush away a fly, and looked at his opponent. The Omega beams did not travel so much as exist in the space between intention and consequence. They were Darkseid's will made manifest, his absolute authority given form. They could not be dodged. They could not be blocked. They could only be survived, and survival was a matter of luck rather than skill. The green-clad warrior twisted in midair, his body moving with instincts that had been honed over millions of repetitions. He almost avoided the first beam. Almost. The Omega energy caught his left leg and unmade it, not severed, not destroyed, but erased from existence as if it had never been. The man's momentum carried him forward even as he screamed, and Darkseid watched with distant interest as the creature's fist, still wreathed in that burning life force, connected with his chest. It hurt. Not much. Not enough to matter. But it hurt, a faint pinprick of sensation that reminded Darkseid that he was, technically, still corporeal. He looked down at the warrior, now falling, now legless, now bleeding out in a spray of arterial blood that steamed in the cold air, and felt something that might have been respect in a lesser being. "You have earned a quick death," Darkseid said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, pressing against the minds of everyone in the village like a physical weight. "This is more than most receive." The warrior, my guy, Darkseid's intelligence had named him, though he had not bothered to remember until now, looked up with eyes that still burned with defiance. "I didn't do it for a reward," he gasped. "I did it for them." Darkseid considered this. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, the Omega beams fired again. My guy's body convulsed once, twice, and then was still, reduced to a scattering of ash that the wind carried across the ruins of his home. Hinata Hyuga had not stopped moving since the invasion began. Her Byakugan blazed at full power, veins standing out around her eyes, as she tracked threats from every direction simultaneously. Her gentle fist had taken down more parademons than she could count. 63, her mind supplied automatically, but the number felt meaningless in the face of the endless tide pouring from the sky. Each enemy she dropped was replaced by 2 more. Each street she cleared filled again within seconds. She was fighting a current, not a battle. And she was losing.
Hanabi!
Hinata screamed, her voice raw from smoke and exertion.
Hanabi, where are you?
A pulse of chakra answered her, her sister's signature, distant but alive. Hinata oriented on it and ran, her feet barely touching the ground, as she vaulted over rubble and dodged through the chaos. The Hyuga compound was 3 blocks away, but 3 blocks in this nightmare might as well have been 300. A parademon dropped from above, its clawed hands reaching for her throat. Hinata didn't slow down. Her palm struck its chest, 8 trigram 64 palms, compressed into a single, devastating point of impact, and the creature exploded outward, its internal pressure finding no release except through its skin. She was already past it before the pieces hit the ground. The compound gates were shattered. The walls were breached. And inside, surrounded by a ring of fallen defenders, Hanabi stood alone, her Byakugan active, her stance wide, her hands dripping with the blood of enemies and friends alike.
Hinata-sama,
Hanabi said, and the honorific felt like a knife.
You shouldn't have come back. I was never gone,
Hinata replied, taking position beside her sister.
Where's father?
The pause told her everything. Hinata closed her eyes. She thought of her father's stern face, his harsh training methods, his impossible standards. She thought of the way he had looked at her after the war, not with pride, exactly, but with something that might have been the closest thing to approval he had ever given. She thought of how he had held her mother's hand during the last illness, how his voice had softened when he thought no one was listening. She opened her eyes.
We hold the compound,
she said.
As long as we can.
Hanabi nodded.
And then?
Hinata looked up at the sky, at the ships, at the cracks in reality, at the figure on the mountain who watched them all die without expression. She remembered Naruto's smile, his laugh, his stupid determination to save everyone no matter the cost. She remembered loving him for 10 years without ever saying it aloud.
Then we buy time for the others to escape,
she said.
That's what shinobi do.
Kakashi Hatake had not cried since the day Obito died. This was not a brag. This was not evidence of strength. This was a problem, a wall he had built between himself and the world that had served him well for decades, but that now threatened to crush him under the weight of everything he was holding back. Because my guy, his rival, his friend, the only person who had never given up on him even when Kakashi had given up on himself, was dead. He had felt it happen. Not through any jutsu or sensory ability, but through something older and more fundamental. A thread that had connected them since childhood had snapped, and the absence of it was a hollow space in Kakashi's chest that threatened to swallow him whole.
Kakashi-sama,
a voice called.
The evacuation is failing,
Kakashi finished. He pulled his headband up, revealing the Sharingan that was no longer his but that he still carried like a curse.
I know.
The shinobi, a young chunin from the Nara clan, Kakashi thought, though he couldn't be sure through the blood and smoke, recoiled from his gaze.
What do we do?
It was a good question. It was the only question that mattered. And Kakashi, for all his strategic brilliance, for all his experience and training and hard-won wisdom, did not have an answer.
Fall back,
he said finally.
Get as many civilians through the tunnels as you can. You'll what?
The voice came from behind him, and Kakashi turned to find Shikamaru approaching through the wreckage. The young strategist looked terrible, burned, bleeding, carrying an arm that hung at the wrong angle, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating.
I'll hold him off,
Kakashi said.
With what? Guy just...
Shikamaru stopped, swallowing hard.
Guy just used the 8th gate. And it didn't work. Nothing worked. He hit that thing with everything he had, and Darkseid just stood there.
Kakashi had seen the moment of impact. He had felt the shockwave from half a mile away. And he had watched, helpless and horrified, as the most powerful taijutsu user in the history of the shinobi world was reduced to ash.
Then we need a different strategy, Kakashi said. There is no strategy.
Shikamaru's voice cracked.
Don't you understand? I've been running scenarios since this started. I've tried everything, every variable, every contingency, every trick I know. And the answer always comes back the same.
He met Kakashi's eye.
We can't win.
The words hung in the air between them, heavy as a death sentence.
Then we make sure as many people survive as possible,
Kakashi said.
That's the mission now. Not victory. Survival.
Shikamaru nodded slowly.
Naruto isn't here.
The words came out harsher than Kakashi intended, and he saw Shikamaru flinch. But it was true. Naruto had been sent on a mission to the Land of Lightning 3 days ago. A diplomatic mission, low risk, meant to be a break after months of high-stakes assignments. He wasn't supposed to be back for another 2 days. 2 days. Kakashi wondered if Konoha would still exist in 2 hours.
Keep trying to reach him,
Kakashi said.
If anyone can turn this around, it's...
The world went white. Not with fire or lightning or any natural phenomenon that Kakashi had ever experienced. The light came from everywhere, from the sky, from the ground, from the air itself, and it carried with it a sound that was not quite sound, a vibration that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his brain. Behold. The voice was not Darkseid's. It was deeper, older, more terrible. It was the voice of something that had existed before the first star ignited and would exist after the last one died. You have been judged. You have been found wanting. This world is forfeit. And then the light pulsed, and Kakashi felt the jutsu formula he had spent his entire life perfecting, the seals, the techniques, the carefully constructed networks of chakra that formed the foundation of his power, begin to dissolve.
No,
he whispered.
No, no, no.
He tried to form the hand signs for a fireball jutsu. His fingers moved through the motions, but nothing happened. The chakra that should have answered his call was gone, not blocked or sealed, but absent, as if the very concept of chakra had been erased from this space. Around him, shinobi screamed as their techniques failed. Walls of earth crumbled. Water prisons evaporated. Shadow possession snapped like threads. The ninja of Konoha had been reduced, in an instant, to ordinary men and women with pointy weapons and no way to use them. The parademons, however, were not affected. They fell upon the fleeing civilians with renewed fury, and Kakashi watched, helpless, useless, ordinary, as his village died around him. Kurama felt it first. The nine-tailed fox was not asleep. He never truly slept, not when his container was away from the village, not when danger might approach, but he had been resting in the cage of Naruto's subconscious, conserving his strength for whatever madness his Jinchuriki would inevitably get them into. The diplomatic mission to the Land of Lightning had been boring, and Kurama had allowed himself to drift into something close to meditation. Then the bubble popped. That was the only way Kurama could describe it. One moment, he was aware of Naruto's chakra flowing normally through the seal networks. The next, something had changed, not the seal itself, but the fundamental nature of the energy that powered it. Chakra, which had always been as natural as breathing, suddenly felt wrong, thin, distant, like it was being drained away by something vast and hungry.
Naruto,
Kurama growled, pushing against the bars of his cage.
Something is happening. Wake up!
His Jinchuriki was already awake. Kurama could feel his consciousness sharp and alert, though still distant, still processing. Naruto was standing on the deck of a ship, the captain having offered them passage back to the Land of Fire after their mission concluded early. The sea stretched around them in all directions, black and cold under a sky that had begun to cloud over in a way that felt wrong.
Do you feel that?
Naruto murmured, and Kurama felt the tension in his container's voice.
Yes. What is it?
Kurama reached outward with his senses, pushing past the borders of Naruto's body and into the wider world. What he found made something cold settle in his ancient stomach. Chakra was dying. Not in one place, but everywhere. It was like watching a fire smother under a blanket, slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. The natural energy that permeated the world, that powered everything from the smallest plant to the largest tailed beast, was being suppressed by something that existed outside the laws of this reality.
I don't know,
Kurama admitted,
but it's coming from the direction of the village.
Naruto's hands tightened on the ship's railing.
How far? Close. Too close. Then we need to move faster.
Naruto turned, already running toward the captain's cabin.
Captain! I need you to.
The ship lurched. Not from a wave or a collision, but from something worse. Something that Kurama recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The fabric of the world was shifting, bending, being folded in ways that it was never meant to fold. And through the gap that was opening in front of them, Kurama could see fire. Konoha was burning.
Naruto,
Kurama said, and his voice was quieter than it had been in centuries.
you need to prepare yourself. Prepare for what? For the fact that whatever you find, it may not be worth saving.
Naruto didn't answer. He was already moving, leaping from the ship before it had finished lurching to a stop, his chakra flaring in a desperate attempt to propel him across the water. But his chakra was fading, weakening, and Kurama felt the first threads of genuine fear begin to weave through his container's mind. Fear for the village. Fear for his friends. Fear for everything he had ever loved.
Hold on,
Kurama whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Naruto or himself.
hold on.
But even as he said it, Kurama knew that some things couldn't be held. Some things could only be lost. The Hokage's office was gone. Tsunade stood in the rubble that had once been the administrative heart of the village, her fists clenched at her sides, her Byakugo seal flickering with the last dregs of chakra she had managed to preserve through sheer force of will. Around her, the remaining council members huddled in what safety they could find. But there was no safety, not anymore, and they all knew it.
Status report,
Tsunade said, because someone had to say something. Danzo Shimura stepped forward from the shadows. The old Warhawk had survived. Of course he had, though his right arm was missing, his Sharingan-covered limb having been destroyed in the initial bombardment. His remaining eye blazed with cold fury.
The village is lost,
Danzo said flatly.
We should have evacuated hours ago. Every moment we remain is a moment wasted. We couldn't evacuate everyone,
Chizun protested.
There were too many. There are always too many.
Danzo turned to Tsunade.
We need to leave. Now! While we still can.
Tsunade looked at him. Looked at the ruins of her home. Looked at the bodies that littered the streets. Bodies of children, of parents, of grandparents, who had trusted her to keep them safe.
No,
she said.
Tsunade-sama. I said no.
Her voice cracked like a whip.
I am the 5th Hokage. I will not abandon this village while a single soul still draws breath within its walls. And when they're all dead?
Danzo asked.
When you're the only one left? What then?
Tsunade didn't have an answer. She didn't get a chance to find one. Because at that moment, the sky above Konoha tore, not cracked this time, but shredded, ripped apart by something that moved between dimensions like a fish through water. And through that wound in reality stepped a figure that Tsunade had hoped never to see. He was smaller than the one on the mountain, maybe 2 meters tall, if that, with pale skin and dark hair, and eyes that held no emotion whatsoever. He wore robes that seemed to be made of shadow, and in his hands, he carried a staff that hummed with a power that made Tsunade's remaining chakra scream in protest.
Granny Goodness sends her regards,
the figure said. His voice was soft, almost gentle.
She wanted me to tell you that resistance is touching in its way. Pointless, but touching.
Tsunade's fist tightened.
Who are you? Desad?
The figure smiled, and it was the coldest thing Tsunade had ever seen.
I'm here to collect the survivors. There are no survivors,
Danzo growled.
Only warriors. Ah.
Desad tilted his head.
Yes. I'd heard that about your people. That you would rather die than submit.
His smile widened.
How fortunate, then, that dying isn't the only option.
He raised his staff. And the world went dark. When Naruto finally reached the shore, there was nothing left to save. The village of Konoha, his home, his dream, his reason for fighting, was a smoking crater. The buildings that still stood were gutted shells, their insides exposed to the terrible alien sky. The streets ran with blood and ash and things that Naruto's mind refused to name. And the smell of burning flesh, of ozone, of something that had no earthly origin, clung to everything like a curse. He walked through the ruins in a daze. His chakra was gone. Not sealed, gone, erased from his body as thoroughly as if he had never possessed it. He could feel Kurama still there, a distant presence behind his ribcage, but the nine-tailed fox's power was just as absent. They were ordinary now. Mortal. Human in a way that Naruto had never been, not since the day the fox had been sealed inside him. He found Sakura first. She was alive, barely. Her arm was gone, torn off at the shoulder, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. But her eyes were open, and they found his face as he knelt beside her, and she smiled.
You came back,
she whispered.
I came back.
Naruto's voice cracked.
Sakura, what happened? Who did this? Don't know.
She coughed, and blood speckled her lips.
Something from outside. Not from our world.
Her eyes drifted closed, then snapped open again with visible effort.
Naruto, they took them.
Who?
Everyone. Everyone who was still alive, they took them. Threw something in the sky.
Her hand, her remaining hand, gripped his vest with desperate strength.
You have to find them. Save them. Like you always do.
Naruto looked up at the sky. The cracks were still there, still oozing that terrible orange-black light. And through the largest of them, he could see something, a world of fire and chains and endless suffering.
I'll find them,
he said.
I swear.
Sakura's hand went limp. Naruto sat in the ashes of his village, holding the body of his oldest friend, and felt something inside him begin to break. Not his will. Not his hope. Something deeper. Something fundamental. Something that he would never get back. The first thing Naruto lost was his name. He didn't realize it at the time. Couldn't really, because the process was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that by the time he noticed the absence, he had already forgotten what the absence meant. Names were anchors. That was one of the first lessons Granny Goodness taught him, in those early days when he still had the capacity to learn. Anchors to identity, to memory, to the illusion of self. And illusions, she explained with a smile that never reached her eyes, were the first things to burn in the fires of apocalypse. He had been brought here in chains. That much he remembered, or thought he remembered, though the memory flickered like a candle in a windstorm, threatening to extinguish every time he reached for it. There had been light first. Blinding, agonizing light that seemed to pour through his eyes and into his skull, burning away thoughts before they could fully form. Then darkness, so complete that he might have been blind. Then pain, not the clean pain of combat or injury, but something slower, deeper, more deliberate. Pain that asked questions. Pain that demanded answers. Pain that reshaped the architecture of his mind one terrible inch at a time. And then, there was Granny Goodness. She was not what he had expected. In the stories the old shinobi told, the ones about monsters and demons and things that lurked in the darkness between worlds, the torturers were always ugly, grotesque. Their faces reflected the corruption of their souls, and you could see the evil in them from a mile away. Granny Goodness looked like someone's grandmother. She was short, plump, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and small hands that seemed better suited to baking cookies than breaking minds. She wore a simple dress of muted gray, and her voice, when she spoke, which was often, and always in a tone of grandmotherly concern, was soft and warm and almost kind. It was the almost that made her terrifying.
You've been asleep for a long time, dear,
she said the first time Naruto opened his eyes in the cell they had given him.
We were starting to worry.
He tried to speak. His throat was raw, his tongue thick and uncooperative. Words came out as sounds, meaningless and broken. Granny Goodness clucked her tongue and pressed a cup of water to his lips, and he drank because he was thirsty, and because refusing had not yet occurred to him as an option.
There we are,
she said, patting his hand.
Better?
He nodded. The motion made his head spin.
You're probably wondering where you are.
She settled into a chair beside his cot, folding her hands in her lap.
You're on Apocalypse, dear. It's a bit different from what you're used to, I imagine. A bit harsher.
She smiled.
But don't worry. We'll take good care of you.
Naruto tried to remember. Tried to reach back through the fog in his mind to the moments before the light, before the pain, before this. There had been something. A village. A fight. Faces, familiar faces, beloved faces, that swam just out of reach.
Sakura,
he rasped.
Where's Sakura?
Granny Goodness's smile didn't waver.
Who? Sakura. My friend. Pink hair. She was.
He stopped, because the memory was already fading, already dissolving like morning frost under a harsh sun.
She was there. When the light came. She was there.
Granny Goodness tilted her head, apparently considering this.
I don't know anyone by that name, dear. Perhaps you dreamed her.
She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead.
Dreams are tricky things. They can make you believe all sorts of things that aren't real. But she was real. I know she was. Do you?
Granny Goodness's voice was gentle, almost pitying.
Can you picture her face? Right now, this moment. Can you see her clearly?
Naruto tried. He tried, summoning every ounce of concentration he possessed, reaching for the image of Sakura that had lived in his heart for as long as he could remember. But the fog was too thick, the memory too distant. All he got were impressions, pink yes, and the sense of something fierce and strong and good. But the details slipped through his fingers like water.
I can't,
he admitted, and the words felt like a confession of failure.
It's all right, dear. That happens sometimes, when the mind has been through a trauma. Things get misplaced.
She patted his hand again.
But don't worry. We'll help you find yourself again. We'll help you become something better.
Naruto didn't understand what she meant. He would. The second thing Naruto lost was his voice. Not literally, he could still speak, still form words, still make sounds, but the will to speak, the instinct to reach out and connect with others through language. Granny Goodness taught him that talking was a luxury, and that luxuries were earned through obedience. In the early days, he talked constantly, asked questions, demanded answers, begged for information about his friends, his village, his world. Each time, Granny Goodness would listen patiently, nod thoughtfully, and then have him beaten. Not by her, of course. She never laid a hand on him. That was part of her genius. She remained the gentle grandmother, the sympathetic ear, the only source of warmth in a world of cold and iron. The beatings came from others. Faceless creatures in masks, or parademons with dead eyes, or sometimes, worst of all, other prisoners, broken and hollowed until they would do anything for a moment of relief.
It's not punishment, dear,
Granny Goodness explained after the third such session, dabbing at a cut above Naruto's eye with a cloth that smelled of antiseptic.
It's conditioning. There's a difference.
Naruto's lip was split. His ribs ached with every breath. One of his fingers, the pinky on his left hand, had been bent backward at an angle that made him nauseous whenever he looked at it.
What's the difference?
He managed.
Punishment is about retribution. About making you suffer for what you've done wrong.
She smiled, gentle and terrible.
Conditioning is about teaching you to choose correctly, so that eventually you won't need to be punished at all. You'll simply know the right way to behave, the right things to say, the right thoughts to think.
She patted his cheek.
It's much kinder, really. Much more efficient.
Naruto wanted to argue. Wanted to scream that there was nothing kind about any of this, that he would never stop asking questions, that he would never stop fighting. But his throat was raw from screaming during the beating, and his jaw ached from where the parade mon had struck him, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, if he stopped talking, the pain would stop too. He didn't speak for 3 days. Granny Goodness brought him food, water, clean bandages. She sat with him in silence, keeping him company without demanding anything in return. And on the 4th day, when he finally whispered,
"Thank you,"
she smiled and told him he was doing so well. He felt proud of himself for making her proud. The realization should have horrified him. It didn't. The third thing Naruto lost was time. Apocalypse had no days, no nights, no natural rhythms to mark the passage of hours. The sky, if it could be called that, was a permanent bruise of orange and red, lit by the fires of factories that never stopped burning and the distant glow of a star that seemed more like a wound than a source of light. There were no clocks in the cells, no calendars, no windows to the outside world. Time became meaningless, a river without banks or current. Days passed. Weeks. Months. Naruto couldn't tell. He was moved from the initial cell after what felt like a week, though it could have been a day or a year for all he knew, to a more permanent facility deeper within the fortress. His new quarters were larger, though no less barren. A cot, a table, a single chair. The walls were the same dark metal as everything else on this world, cold to the touch and utterly unyielding. He was not alone. Other prisoners occupied the cells around him, beings from a dozen worlds, 100 species, all wearing the same dazed expression of broken obedience. Some had been here for years, Naruto learned. Some had been here for centuries. Time worked differently on Apocalypse, the old one said. It stretched and compressed according to Darkseid's will, an instrument of control as precise as any chain or collar. Naruto tried to befriend them. It was his nature, had always been his nature, to reach out to the lonely and the lost, to find connection in isolation. But the prisoners looked through him, or past him, or at him with eyes that held nothing but emptiness. They had been conditioned to expect pain from connection, safety from solitude. They flinched when he spoke to them, cowered when he approached. Granny Goodness watched all of this from the shadows, and smiled.
Friends are anchors, dear,
she told him one day, when she found him sitting alone in his cell, staring at the wall.
They tie you to who you were. And who you were.
She paused, letting the weight of the words settle.
Who you were is gone now. Holding on to ghosts will only hurt you.
Naruto looked up at her. His eyes, once so bright, so full of life and determination, had begun to dim.
I don't want to forget them. I know, dear. That's what makes it so hard.
She sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender powder she used on her skin.
But here's a secret. Forgetting isn't something that happens to you. It's something you do. A choice you make over and over, until the choice becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a truth.
She took his hand in hers.
The question is, what kind of truth do you want to live in? One of pain and loss and endless longing? Or one of peace? There's no peace in forgetting. Isn't there?
Granny Goodness squeezed his fingers.
You remember fire, don't you? How it burns. How it hurts. And yet, you don't spend every moment thinking about that pain. You've learned to let it go. To move on. To live in the present instead of the past.
She tilted her head.
That's all I'm asking you to do. Let go of the fire. Let go of the burning. Let yourself heal.
Naruto wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that his friends weren't fire, weren't pain, weren't something to be forgotten and moved past. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere in the depths of his fractured memory, he could no longer picture Sakura's face. Could no longer hear Kakashi's voice. Could no longer remember the exact shade of Sasuke's eyes. They were fading. And he was letting them. Kurama watched all of this from the cage of Naruto's subconscious, and for the first time in his millennia-long existence, the nine-tailed fox knew true fear. Not fear for himself. He had lived too long, seen too much, to be afraid of his own death. But fear for Naruto, for the boy who had somehow, impossibly, become more than a container. The boy who had looked into the heart of a monster and seen something worth saving. The boy who had refused to give up on him, even when everyone, said that monsters couldn't change. That boy was dying. Not his body. Granny Goodness was too careful for that, too precise in her cruelty. She wanted Naruto alive, healthy, functional. A broken tool was useless. A reprogrammed one was invaluable. So she fed him, watered him, gave him just enough rest to keep his mind from shattering entirely. She was cultivating him, the way a gardener cultivates a bonsai tree, pruning away the branches she didn't want, shaping the ones she did, creating something beautiful and controlled and artificial. And Kurama could do nothing to stop her. The suppression of chakra that had occurred during the invasion had not faded. If anything, it had deepened on Apocalypse, reinforced by the very fabric of this dimension. The natural energy that Kurama had spent 9 centuries accumulating was still there, somewhere, buried beneath layers of interference that he couldn't penetrate. He could feel it, a distant hum, like a memory of power, but he couldn't reach it, couldn't channel it, couldn't use it to break the chains that bound Naruto's mind. All he could do was watch. And remember. He remembered the day the Sage of 6 Paths had split the 10 tails into 9 pieces, creating the tailed beasts as separate entities. He remembered the millennium that followed, the fear, the hatred, the endless running. He remembered being sealed inside human after human, each one more broken than the last, until he had stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as prisons. Then, there was Naruto. Kurama had hated him at first. Hated his stupidity, his stubbornness, his ridiculous belief that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. He had tried to consume the boy's chakra, to corrupt his mind, to break his spirit. And Naruto had simply refused. Had stared into the face of a demon and said, "I'm going to save you," as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And somehow, impossibly, he had. Kurama had learned to love again, to trust again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to existence than pain and survival. Naruto had given him that. Naruto had reached into the darkness where Kurama had lived for 1,000 years and pulled him, kicking and screaming, into the light. Now it was Kurama's turn.
Naruto,
He said, pushing against the bars of his cage with all the strength he could muster.
Naruto, can you hear me?
No response. The connection between them, that golden thread of understanding and trust that had taken years to weave, was frayed almost to nothing. Naruto could still feel Kurama's presence, probably, but only as background noise. Only as another piece of the fog that filled his mind.
Listen to me,
Kurama continued, because stopping wasn't an option.
You're forgetting. I know you are. But there are things that can't be forgotten, no matter how hard they try. The taste of ramen from Ichiraku's. The sound of Sakura's laugh. The way the village looks at sunset, when the Hokage monument casts long shadows across the valley.
He paused, gathering himself.
The promise you made to me. That you would never give up. That you would never let anyone tell you what you could or couldn't be.
Nothing. Silence. The crushing, absolute silence of a mind being slowly erased. And then, so faint that Kurama almost missed it.
Kurama? I'm here, Kit. I'm right here. I can't.
Naruto's mental voice was weak, fragmented, like a radio signal struggling through static.
I can't remember. Everything is slipping. I try to hold on, but it's like grabbing smoke. Then stop trying to hold on.
What? Kurama pressed himself against the bars of his cage, close enough that he could almost feel the warmth of Naruto's consciousness.
Memories aren't things you possess, Kit. They're things you are. Every moment you've lived, every person you've loved, every battle you've fought, all of it is still inside you. They can bury it, but they can't erase it. Not completely. How do you know? Because I've been alive for 1,000 years, and I've seen a lot of monsters try to destroy a lot of things. But the one thing that always survives, the one thing that keeps coming back, no matter how many times you kill it, is love.
Kurama's voice softened.
You love them, Naruto. You love them still. That's not something Granny Goodness can take from you. It's not something anyone can take from you. It's who you are.
For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint that Kurama almost missed it.
Help me. I will,
Kurama promised.
I will.
Granny Goodness knew about Kurama. Of course she did. She knew about everything that happened in her domain, every whispered conversation, every secret thought, every desperate prayer to gods, who had long since abandoned this place. The nine-tailed fox's presence within the boy was not a surprise. It was an opportunity. Another thread to pull, another lever to press, another piece of the intricate puzzle that was Naruto Uzumaki. She did not try to suppress Kurama directly. That would have been crude, inefficient. The kind of brute force approach that Desad favored, with his needles and his probes and his endless, pointless experiments. Granny Goodness was more subtle. She understood that the best way to break a bond was not to attack it head-on, but to starve it. To make it irrelevant. To replace it with something newer, shinier, more immediately rewarding. So she gave Naruto a new voice to listen to. Hers. Not directly. That would have been too obvious, too easy to reject. Instead, she embedded her words in the routine of his existence. In the food she brought him, the blanket she gave him,